We need to talk about game key cards because they suck. And nobody, or at least very few people, want to buy them, as evident by the fact that third-party games on the Switch 2 are selling beyond the lowest of low expectations the publishers and developers had. And I have a lot of thoughts as to why, and it's not just because they're game key cards, but it's mostly because they're game key cards. And unless we do something about it, other than not buy them, whoops. I'll talk about that in a second. Directly, I made Hey Nintendo, the eShop sucks, where I talked about, take a guess. And now on the Switch 2, Nintendo has actually addressed a lot of those issues. And while I'm not taking sole credit for that, even though the video had over 1 million views and surely Nintendo had to see it, and some of my actual suggestions were taken exactly and utilized on the new eShop, it's more the case of when we actually vocally talk about it and say what we like and don't like, and then share that, that's how change happens. And god damn it, I'm a physical collector. I don't know if you can tell by looking behind me. I have a lot of Switch 1 games. I do not want to do this anymore. I made a commitment at launch to buy every single Switch 2 game because I wanted to make the video where I reviewed them all. And I decided within myself that at least buying the game key cards is better than digital. It's an empty cart. It's a waste of plastic and a bit of artwork, but at least I can put something on the shelf. But I gotta be honest, I think I'm done. Because this sucks. A little bit of my soul died every single time I bought one. And so I can't imagine how you feel or how anyone feels going into a game store and being faced with the decision of, do I buy a hunk of plastic or just go home and get it digital? And that apparently is the issue a lot of people are having. As I said, third-party games on Switch are selling well below the lowest of expectations. I think this is clearly because of the game key card format. Nobody wants to buy these. I even did a poll on my podcast recently and asked, would you rather buy a game key card of a game or just buy it digital? And 70% of my viewers on a Nintendo themed podcast happily voted I would rather just buy digital. And here is where the issue lies. It's really at Nintendo. It's easy to point at Puyo Puyo Tetris 2 and say, oh, look at the corporate greed of this little green squidgy opting for the cheap game key card and not trying to buy a physical. Well, you might know this already, but they didn't really have an option because the only cartridges that Nintendo have pushed out for people to buy are the game key carts, which are an empty blank game key card with like 1 megabyte of storage data that essentially just triggers a download from the eShop onto your system and stores absolutely no information and memory, or a 64 gigabyte card that each of these games have. That is the only other option. And you know what else makes me mad? Even madder than the game key cart situation. It's when I'm watching a YouTube video and it gets interrupted by an ad or a sponsored spot. It sucks. This rant is sponsored by Surfshark. A VPN will mask your IP address, and you can also change your IP address. And that's how you change location into somewhere like Australia or UK. And when you do that, you can log into that region's Netflix or any other streaming site. It's a really great hack to get full access to the internet. And when you already pay $1 billion a month for services like Netflix, why shouldn't you get full access to the library? That's the main reason I use a VPN, but it is true that it helps protect your privacy, and it does that by creating a secure tunnel around all of the data that you send back and forth online every single day. It's an encrypted network. I'm sure you've experienced this a ton where you get recommended ads based on what you've been searching, or you get those scam phone calls and texts and emails. It's because the internet just wants all of your data and information. So do your best to protect yourself and use Surfshark VPN. It even has a built-in antivirus, which I absolutely love, and I've talked about this a ton, but it did actually find a key logging executable on my computer, meaning someone was actively keeping tabs on what I was typing. But thankfully, the Surfshark VPN antivirus deleted all of those and cleaned my computer and made it safe again. That's actually the reason why I started using Surfshark VPN even before they were sponsoring the channel. So whether you're trying to protect yourself or uncensor content, Surfshark VPN has a 30-day money-back risk-free guarantee. So there's no harm in trying it out. You can use one account on unlimited devices, and you can do all of that by clicking the link in the description or going to surfshark.com/beatemups to get 4 extra months free of Surfshark VPN. I love Surfshark so much, I actually forgot how mad I was about these game key cards. Thankfully, this guy's still pissed. So let's let him finish the video. The more gigs you have and the more express fast SSD super micro fast card that you have that Switch 2 games need to run in, the more expensive that is. So even for a 64 gig card, it costs $15 on the developer and publisher side to buy the cart from Nintendo to release their game. So suddenly, when you have a game like Puyo Puyo Tetris 2, which is $40 already, they would be looking at cutting into almost exactly half of their profits, which means their options are digital and get full price for their game, or physical and lose half of their profit margin. So what's the other option? Game key card. And that's why these exist, and that's why all of these developers are opting for them. In fact, Nintendo should really have done a game key card even for Mario Kart World, because Mario Kart World is only about a 25 gigabyte game, which means over half of the cartridge it's on isn't being used. So why isn't Nintendo offering these developers and these publishers other cheaper cards? Like on the Switch 1, for example. The Switch 1 had a range of cards that you can buy. 5, 10 gigs all the way up to 32. All I know is the largest card was actually pretty expensive. For Switch 1, the Resident Evil collections, for example, they'd get a smaller cart, put one game on it, and then the rest would be a DLC download code. That could be seen as greed. But on the Switch 2, developers really don't have a choice. And I ask you again, why? Why did Nintendo have all these card sizes on Switch 1 and then they didn't on Switch 2? Well, a theory I have, when you play a Switch 2 game, you have 3 options. You can buy Cyberpunk and you can run the game off the cartridge, or you can download Cyberpunk and you can run it off of your Switch locally, or you can download Cyberpunk, run it off the Express micro SSD in your Switch. And there are people that have done comparisons of all 3. Actually, the cartridge is just a fraction slower, but it still manages to keep up with those other super fast forms like the Express SD. So these cartridges that Nintendo are putting out are super fast and super expensive. So I think even if they made a 10 gigabyte or a 20 gigabyte or a 32 gig and gave developers more options, they would still be expensive. And maybe Nintendo hasn't figured that out yet, so they just offered 2 versions. But that doesn't help us now, and it sucks for the third-party developers that chose to support the Switch on launch. Going back to the Wii U, there was no third-party developers or publishers willing to support Nintendo and their weird, wacky choices with the gamepad and how hard it was to develop games for that console. And moving into Switch 1, they really had to repair that trust. But it meant there wasn't many third-party developers willing to support Nintendo in the first year. It was a slow crawl to start getting those games pouring into the system. And a lot of developers actually feel like by the time the Switch was exploding in popularity, they'd missed their mark. So when it came to Switch 2, there were a lot of developers that wanted to jump on board right away. And then they found out they weren't going to be able to do a physical on the cartridge release unless they spent $15 into their profits. So they all opted for the game key cards. And then the expectations were not met and they sold at the lowest of low. And you know how much that sucks? That Nintendo actually managed to get third-party developers back on board and they all got burned right off the rip, because a lot of these developers wanted to be there day one because there's such a thing as an impulse purchase. They have their console, they got their controller, they got Mario Kart, and they're looking at the shelf and they're like, what else could I go home with today? That's the moment. That's when everyone's in the store. You got free marketing on all of the Switch 2 games and you want people to pick up, and every single one was a game key card. And I know this happened to you. Every single person looked at those and went, well, I can get it digital later if I decide I want that. I guess there's no rush in getting it now. There was no immediate, I should buy this because it's not anything you're buying. That's why the third-party games did so badly. It's because there was no impulse purchases and nobody in general wanted to support game key cards. Okay, wait, even though I'm wearing the same shirt, I'm filming this a few days later because something happened today. Well, kind of nothing happened today, but something happened today relevant to this, because Nintendo just did their annual shareholders meeting, and in that meeting, a shareholder called the game key cards a half-baked measure and asked why so many third-party publishers use them. He also asked whether or not they impact sales, and he asked this directly to the president of Nintendo, Furukawa. So while Furukawa didn't really give an answer, he just said that game key cards were conceived as an option to help publishers bring their games to retail and that they were consulted with ideas on how to sell in this format. He didn't really want to talk about how it impacted sales, because of course, he's not going to want to talk about that with shareholders when the publishers themselves are saying they're selling the lowest of lows. Like, he's not going to want to bring that up. And this is good. Although it doesn't change anything yet, right? Because Nintendo kind of dodged it. So we still need to be vocal about this. We still need to put this external pressure on Nintendo with videos like this and conversations like this. But this is good because there's clearly now internal pressure as well. Cracks are forming in the world of Game Key cards. Internally, they are being told, hey, these are half-baked measures that don't work. And alongside this video, you have external pressure saying, hey, we don't want to buy these. So I'm going to let this video continue as it's just as relevant now as it was earlier when I filmed it. But I know a lot of people are going to blame the low sales on other things. So let's talk about that. I've seen a lot of people saying that because Mario Kart and Nintendo's own hardware, it priced people out of buying extra games. So essentially you buy the console, Mario Kart controller, maybe the camera, you're already at like $800. In fact, if you look at the breakdown of what sold the most at launch, clearly it was Mario Kart and it was Zelda, and then Cyberpunk did really well. So that was the first big third-party support game people were willing to pick up because CD Projekt Red did the right thing and opted to sink that cost on a $15 cartridge. So do I think that people got priced out? In general, yes, of course. Of course, most people were only interested in getting Mario Kart, were only interested in getting Zelda. I know it seems like sometimes publishers and developers have no idea what's going on, but they all have marketing leads. They have people in the business that probably studied for it, that probably went to university, right? They account for all of the variables and not just a YouTuber sitting in his basement. When they say it sold beyond the lowest of low expectations, what they mean is they expected a number of high and then here's like a low based on all of those variables. They had that expectation because of what their game is, because of how old it is, because of the timing that it's being released, because it's day one on Switch. Like they take all of that into account, and despite all of that, it was lowest of lows. So I pose to you, if that is the case, if something went wrong, what is the one thing they couldn't account for? Game key cards, because it's never happened before. They didn't know what to expect in that case. It messed up their expectations and it made it sell at the lowest of lows. So anything that you can hit me with, oh, but it's this and it's that and it's this, the developers and publishers expected that. They didn't expect the game key cards to be so universally hated and just people refusing to buy them. And I think any argument in that case is completely destroyed by Cyberpunk. Cyberpunk quite literally is a 5-year-old game. It's 2 generations ago, despite it barely running on PlayStation 4. And not only that, it's notoriously been panned as bad. They've done a lot to fix it over the years, but you remember my video and you know how the sentiment of this game has been. It's really a mixed bag of people that hate it and like it and just can't be bothered with it. And they re-released it for $70 and it's the best third-party selling game on the Switch 2 at launch. I feel like I don't have to beat my head against the wall any more than that. Over 80% of the Switch 2 software sales came from physical retailers. Here we hit one of our first problems that I really have with this, and a lot of people should have with this. Nintendo is a nostalgic company. We grew up with Nintendo, and Nintendo feels like a toy. It feels very physical. Nintendo themselves release amiibos, actual toys that we buy and we spend $30, $40 on now because we want Nintendo toys. Nintendo just released an alarm clock, which is essentially an alarm clock toy. Everything about Nintendo is baked in nostalgia. It's GameCube releases on the system again with a physical controller Nintendo made to resemble a GameCube controller that we all lined up and bought. We want to own what we have when it comes to Nintendo, and we want to collect when it comes to Nintendo. Not everybody. Some people like digital, but the point that I'm making is 80% of people want to buy physical. So even though 80% of sales came from physical retailers, it was still beyond the lowest of low for expectations, which means digital isn't doing much better, which means Nintendo is really just shooting themselves and third-party developers and publishers and support on the console in the foot by not having an answer day one to this game key card situation, because everyone wants to buy physical, but nobody wants to buy this physical. And by this physical, I mean I'm pointing at the stack of games I have here. I talked earlier about splinter issues and things that you probably haven't thought about yet. And here's my biggest one. What sense does it make for a game like Stardew Valley, which is $15 on the eShop, to release a physical on the cartridge when the cartridge costs $15 for them to buy? That leads us in 2 positions. One, we are just not going to get indie games physicals this time around. Like, that's it. We're not going to get physical games for anything other than games probably over $50 or more, because anyone that has a game under 50 just aren't going to bother chipping into their profits. So the one way we get through this is we just don't get physicals for games, which sucks. A reason why that sucks too is because at least with eShop indie games, they're always all on the cart because the file sizes are so small. Like, a big issue we face with games like Hogwarts Legacy and Call of Duty on PlayStation 5 is the games are so big, they can't fit on a Blu-ray disc. So the games are literally game key carts. There's almost no data on the disc, and you download the whole game when you put the disc in and connect to the internet. But there's other games that aren't on the disc and they have part of it on the disc. There's almost no way of getting around any of that because the formats just don't get that big. But with indie games, you can actually have the whole game on the cartridge. You can actually fit all of Enter the Gungeon on a $20 Switch 1 cartridge and put it in your game room and have the game. Have the game. Not anymore. Even Puyo Puyo Tetris, a 4 GB game, had to do a game key cart, and it was a $40 release. And that's the next thing. We had two options, remember? One, we just don't get them. Two, we get them, but they're $10, $15 more. Either way, for the consumer, we're screwed. Video game prices are either gonna go up because of game key cards, or we're just not going to get physicals. Internal storage is only 250 gigs. And let me tell you, when you're buying games like Hitman, which is 61 gigs on its own, and then you add in Yakuza, which is 57 gigs, then you add in Hogwarts, which is 24 gigs, surprisingly a little bit smaller. Street Fighter is 50 gigs. Just the games in my hand right now will fill up that $60 SD card and leave you almost no room. So while these game key carts might seem like they are saving developers and publishers money, they're actually directly hurting those developers and publishers' sales. It's also hurting consumers, who really get nothing out of this deal, and any solution or workaround to game key cards actually being viable just cost us more money. I think best case scenario for game key cards, Nintendo actually offers variable sizes for carts, 5 gigs, 10 gigs, 20, 32, 64. So something like Puyo Puyo Tetris doesn't need to only have a 64 gig cart or a key cart, but keep the key carts. I'm not against them. There is actually a use case for game key cards that I don't mind, and that's games that are over 64 gigs anyway, because I don't want 50 gigs of a game on a cartridge just to download the next 20 to make it playable. If the whole game isn't on the cartridge, what's the point? But Bravely Default is 11 gigs. I'm pretty sure if there was a 10 gig cart, the developers would have found a way to make this 10 gigs, and we would have had this physical, and it would have been a $40 physical release, and probably would have sold way better and way better than any other game that was a game key card at launch. This is my plea to you, Nintendo. Make more cartridges. I don't know why you're not. There has to be a reason beyond just we don't want to. It doesn't even make sense for your own games like Mario Kart to be on a 64 gigabyte cartridge. So maybe it's a chip shortage, maybe it's tariff related, maybe it's because you can't find a way to make smaller cards this fast, but please find some sort of solution, because as it is right now, physical sales are taking a huge dump, and the third-party developers that have supported this console at launch that you've regained the trust of are being let down. But more than anything, us, the consumers, are being let down, because we are, at our core, Nintendo fans. We want to collect, we want to own, we want to cherish, we want to appreciate, and we don't want to feel like we have to buy a digital game out of spite. I don't think that's an ecosystem you want to foster. I think you want those things flying off the shelf, don't you? I think you want this to go insane, not just for you, Nintendo, to make money off your $80 new game. I think you want your third parties to do well as well, right? Like, I think that's a very important part of all of this, because you don't want to have another Wii U. All right, that's it. Nintendo, please fix it. And if you also share the sentiment of this video, just let me know down below. But mostly, if you agree and you think this is an issue, share it around. Help this video get exposure. And I know I'm saying that because obviously I want my video to do well, but also the more people that react to this situation and the more people that are vocal about what the issue is, the more likely it is that this will get fixed. And I really need it to get fixed, because I am not lying when I say I'm seriously considering just going digital and not supporting this. All right, I love you guys. Bye.